There are plenty of ways you can get fast, but it's my belief and through my experience that I believe that polarized training is the best way to get faster at rowing while also maximizing quality of life around rowing, your happiness and your enjoyment of the sport. It gets the best results. If you want to talk about how another country or another teammate or how when you were younger you did a different type of training that wasn't like polarized training and it got you results, then this video isn't for you. Keep doing what you're doing. Keep doing the same things you always done and get the same results. If you want to have an open mind about your training, you're interested in polarized training, you want to find out how it works, how to do it, some evidence behind why it works, then this video is for you. If you watch this video and you've got any questions towards the end of it, if there's anything I've not answered, feel free to put the comments. It's really helpful for me when I go to make videos about this in the future if I can understand what I need to explain better. And again, if you like this kind of content, like it. It shows me that I should keep making more of it. So I'll try and make this kind of an introduction into polarized training. I'll try and keep it maybe more on the beginner side of it, explore some theory, but then I think if I can do a good job of it, then I'll be able to explain the full detail of it in a way that's relevant to beginners or relevant to elite. So polarized training is basically comes from, think of the poles, so opposite ends of the world or whatever. So it's opposite ends of a training zone. So there's so many ways you can divide training zones. There's the 5-zone model, which is 1 would be the lowest zone and then 5 is the highest. There's the 3-zone model, which again, 1's the lowest, 2's the middle, 3's the highest. That's one I think works the best. And then there's also the UT2, UT1 threshold transport model as well. But generally, with polarized training, you want to keep 80% of your training to be done at a low intensity and 20% of your training to be done at a high intensity and none of it to be done in the middle. So to quickly run through the kind of different models that you've maybe heard before, with a 5-zone model, zones 1 and 2 are low intensity and zones 4 and 5 are the high intensity. And then the 3 of that 5-zone model is kind of that area that you want to avoid. With the 3-zone model, this is the most simple. Again, Charlie Simpson talks about using this and why he thinks it's the best. I think it's the best as well. Zone 1 is the low intensity, zone 2 is the middle bit that you avoid, and zone 3 is the high intensity that you want to be spending, or again, around 20% of your time in, 80% in the low end zone, zone 1 of the 3-zone model, and then 0% of your time in the middle zone. And then the last zone, again, some of these terms that I use a little bit in my training because you have to be specific with it, but UT2, UT1, UT3 even. So again, this is where it can get a bit confusing because UT2 is lower than UT1 in terms of intensity. But then when you look at like the zone 1, 2, and 3 model, obviously as you're going up the numbers, that's an increase in intensity. So both in the 3-zone model, zone 1, 2, 3, and in the 5-zone model, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, as you go up the numbers, the intensity gets higher. The only exception to this where it kind of can be a bit confusing is that UT2, 2 is obviously the higher number, but then UT1 is a higher intensity of when compared to UT2. So again, I'll write this up, I'll put a graphic up, hopefully it'll be a bit more obvious. Within the UT2 sort of language, threshold is the middle zone that you want to avoid, and then transport is basically high intensity, working really hard. So there's a few ways that you can find your intensities in the zones. Now, basically your high intensity, there's not really a way you need to calculate how to figure out your high intensity is and like what those splits should be and what those numbers should be. It's basically just work as hard as you possibly can. So these are the sessions where it's maybe 6x500s or 3x10 minutes or 4x2K or whatever, where you're just working as hard as you possibly can and you're going for the fastest speed that you can get within that. Generally, or maybe if that was 100% of your capacity, you're kind of in that, you know, a 9 out of 10 if you were ranking how hard you went, and 8 out of 10 if you're ranking how hard that session is. Basically, you don't have to think about calculating it, just go as hard as you can, generally. Now, with the low intensity, it's basically, there's a few ways you can calculate it. The important thing to note is that when you do low intensity right within polarized training, it feels too easy. And again, this is something that I want to get to that people really struggle with low intensity, is that they feel like they're doing way too easy of an effort in order to get benefit. So again, I'll talk you through some reasons, talk you through some science as well that shows that it works. But basically, some of the ways you can calculate your low intensity is probably the easiest way to do it, and often one of the most accurate ways you can actually do it is RPE, so rate of perceived exertion, where on a scale of 1 to 10, now again there's scales that are 1 to 20, but generally I like to keep it simple, 1 to 10 of how hard it is. So 10 is the hardest that you can go that day, and then like 0 would be just like me sitting in a chair here, doing nothing, sit on the couch, whatever. And then obviously the numbers anywhere in between that. So 1 I'd class as maybe like a walk, but a kind of 2 to 4 out of 10 in terms of like how hard you're going is how you could class low intensity. Again, this is the simplest, often one of the most effective ways that you can just work out what your low intensity zone is. Again, one of the kind of my go-tos is a 65% to a 72% of your max heart rate, and you want your heart rate to sit within that range for the whole of the session, and you kind of want the average heart rate to be within that zone. And generally, you know, sometimes towards the end of longer sessions or when it's hotter, that heart rate can kind of creep up into that 75%, but generally you don't want to go any more than 75% of your max heart rate for UT2, for low intensity, for zone 1 of 3, or for zone 1 and 2 of the 5-zone model. So if your max heart rate was around 200 beats per minute, then that's around 130 beats per minute to around 145 beats per minute. Now, I've done a video on this before in the Row Faster series, Finding Your Splits. Go and check it out. I break this down in a lot more detail. Now, you can also use watts and a percentage of your watts. This isn't always the most accurate. You get some people that aren't as aerobically efficient, their endurance isn't as good. But first off, you want to use watts because on a scale, when watts go up, when you're taking percentages of that, it's not the same as basically taking percentages of splits, which as you go up per second, if you were to graph the effort required going up in speed per second, it starts to increase like non-linearly, so it accelerates. Every second is a bigger jump, basically. Like, for example, if you were looking at splits and you went from 30 seconds per 500 to 29 seconds per 500, that 1 second jump is a much bigger jump in speed and effort in watts and power than when you went from a 230 split to a 229 split per 500. So it's important to use watts. Again, just go to the Concept2 website. There's some formulas you can use in a spreadsheet or whatever, but just go to the Concept2 website, type in pace to watts calculator, and they've got a wee thing there you can put in the splits. But once you get the watts of your 2K, again, if you want to use 5K or your 30/20, go and check out that video. But if you want to use your 2K watts, generally sit in roughly around 47 to kind of 52% of those watts. That would be your UT2, your low intensity, your zone 1 of 3, your zone 1 and 2 of 5. Again, maybe I should just stop talking about the zones and the numbers at risk of becoming too confusing, but I'm trying to cover everything in order to give people the best understanding. So if some things go over your head, don't worry, just try and pick 1 or 2 things that you can take away. Now, probably one of the least accessible ways that you can figure out your zones is by doing lactate testing. Now, some of my athletes, when I get in person with them, this is one of the first things that we do. More data, the better, in my opinion. I know some people are scared of data. Basically, if you do a lactic acid step test, or you just basically take a prick of blood as you're training, you want that. Again, there's a bit of conflicting evidence. They say that, you know, low intensity should be below 2 minimals. Personally, I think that low intensity should be below 1.5, even less than that. That's generally where your low intensity, your UT2 should be. Again, to get into the bit of the zone that you want to avoid at all costs is kind of that 2 to 4 minimals of lactic acid, which is basically just the burn. Again, lactic acid is the burn that you feel when your body starts to exercise. But again, generally for most people here, I'm going to suggest avoiding thinking about lactic acid. It's very accurate, but it's not accessible, and this is just some information that's probably irrelevant to you. So to get into the why we want to do polarized training, why we want to spend 80% of our time in low intensity roughly and 20% of our time in high intensity. What I want to explain first is, like, maybe you're thinking, okay, what does that mean? 80% of my total time training, Do I want to spend that? So say I had 100 minutes in a week to train. Do I want to spend 80 of those minutes doing low intensity and 20 of those minutes doing high intensity? Or, you know, if I have 10 sessions in a week, again, I'm just using these numbers because they're easier for the maths. If I have 10 sessions in a week, do 8 of those sessions want to be low intensity and 2 want to be high? Now, one thing that the evidence in polarized training isn't clear on is exactly what that split should be. But generally, I suggest doing in a week 1 to an absolute maximum of 3 high intensity sessions per week. And then basically try and make the rest of that as much low intensity as you can manage generally. So high intensity is a very, very effective way to get fit. It's a very effective way to expose yourself to a stimulus that your body's forcing itself to adapt to. Okay, aerobic, working on your aerobic system. Okay, you want to do low intensity endurance, but also high intensity improves your aerobic endurance. It also improves your lactate tolerance. High intensity, it makes sense. Work hard, get faster. The question then becomes is how much do we want to do? Well, this study shows, again, there's plenty of studies, but just pick this one, shows that roughly it takes around 2 to 3 days for your body to recover from high intensity, to recover from the muscle damage, to recover from the oxidative stress, roughly 2 to 3 days. So you do not want to be doing high intensity any more than once every 2 to 3 days. Generally, I think 3 days, once every 3 days is good. Again, depending on your training block, it might just be once every 6 days. What happens when you do it more than that if you're not recovering? It's basically, if you're up here, of course we want to, if this is you in your best shape and you're kind of training along and then you do high intensity and you get very fatigued, you go down, but of course we want to push you into a state of fatigue so your body can adapt and recover faster. And it takes you around 2 to 3 days to get back up to that base. Okay, right, let's make this the baseline. This is you at good shape, you're up here, you do high intensity really hard, you go back down, you take 2 to 3 days, but then maybe say after 2 days, you go back and do high intensity and you knock yourself back down again. You're not getting back up to that top level, you go back down like that again. And then again, if you do it sooner, you don't recover in time, you go back up, you're not getting back up high enough. And then generally what happens, again, this is what one of my old coaches always said, people that do high intensity training all the time, programs that do high intensity all the time, your repeated high intensity, your body ends up not recovering from it. You end up probably just doing low intensity anyways, effectively, because you're not recovering back to that baseline, to that place where you can push it to the quality that you need to. High intensity training needs to be a very high quality in order to get the adaptations that you want from it. So if you're not recovering from that high intensity, you're not able to work at a high intensity, you're not able to get the benefit of the high intensity. Okay, so long story short, do high intensity once to twice a week at an absolute maximum 3 times per week. The next question becomes, what sort of training do we want to do around that high intensity? So one of the most kind of agreed upon things in endurance sports like rowing, cycling, triathlon is that volume, massive amounts of volume produce results. The more volume you can do, roughly up to around 100k a week, there's extreme benefit in that. So the next question becomes, how can we do as much of that as possible? What's the maximum intensity that we need to work to get the benefit of the low intensity to be able to do it consistently? That is why it's so important to find the right zone for your low intensity so that you can do it consistently, so you can do more of it, and so that you can get the benefits of it. Also, at the same time, while you're doing that low intensity, because it's at the right intensity, you're able to recover from the high intensity while also continuing to get adaptations, to build mitochondria in your cells, to improve your aerobic capacity, to improve your endurance, to get faster. So if you want to find out the right zone, use those kind of methods I talked about before for finding it, use a combination of that, do that low intensity around your high intensity. That is polarized training. Okay, right, an example of a week, probably let's just pull one out for the average athlete that I coach, say is on 4 to 6 sessions, let's just pick 6 sessions a week on the rowing machine, maybe not including strength training, different story. 6 sessions is simple. If we're far away from a competition, we want to do lots of volume, or I've just brought them in and we want to bring them up gradually, we'd probably pick 1 high intensity session per week. So that would be 3x2K, 3x10 minutes, 4x2, at a low rate, 30 rate, 20 absolute max. That's your high intensity session. Okay, that's one of them. Just pick one of those and do that. Say generally on an easier week, they're doing 30 minutes of low intensity. For those other 5 sessions, we might have one session that's a UT2, UT1 session where there's a bit of going into the higher end of that low intensity, where we just push into maybe that 75% max heart rate for one of those low intensity sessions. But generally those 5 other sessions would be low intensity. Maybe on a low week, we do 30 minutes on average, a higher week, 50 minutes, and then for well-trained athletes that have the time available, pushing into 60, 70 minutes at a maximum. If we're getting closer to competition, that might shift, where we keep that volume. Again, you want to keep this volume high, very close into the competition or race or whatever you're wanting to peak for. We might introduce 2 high-intensity sessions per week. Again, some athletes that we have respond better to 3 high-intensity sessions per week, but generally following that kind of 2 high-intensity sessions per week. The other 4, keep that low intensity there. Now, I want to get into some of the kind of reasons that I think, through my observations, through my experience, as to why people have a problem with this. Now, for some reason, in the rowing world, people are just, they don't have an open mind. They're very stuck in the old times. They don't look at evidence. They just keep doing what we've always done. And again, this is another subject, but I think it's part of the reason we're getting left behind in terms of a sport, in terms of progress. But it's just so tempting for people to see kind of maybe elite athletes that they know can do whatever a Ollie Ziedler or whoever does 148 for low intensity, for them to think, okay, well, because that low intensity, you know, people can't copy the elite high intensity. They can't copy what people can do for 6x500s or whatever, but they can copy what the elites do for low intensity. So they think, okay, right, I'll push that then. So then they try and do low intensity training at the splits that the elites do it, and then it ends up being way too hard, something that they're not able to recover from. Now, again, another subject is why to avoid that mid zone, and that's the zone that people end up pushing into when they do things like say, oh, I want to push my UT2 on, I want to push my low intensity on, so I start pulling harder at a low intensity. You cross this threshold into that mid zone, which is also called threshold training, which is roughly 75% to roughly 82% of your max heart rate. RPE would be around a 5 to maybe a 7. On the lactic acid, it's roughly from 2 minimals to around 4 minimals. And it's that middle zone, once you kind of cross that threshold of 72% of your max heart rate, or an RPE of 5, or 2 minimals of lactic acid, that your body starts to produce a lot more catecholamines, they're called. That's the fancy name for them. It's norepinephrine and epinephrine, or it's basically just your stress hormones that we don't want and that don't make us faster. It's adrenaline and cortisol that start getting increased once we cross that sort of threshold into that mid zone. And we cross that zone, and it's in that zone that your body starts to produce lots of these harmful hormones. Now, in the high intensity zone, you also produce these hormones, but because it's at such a high intensity that your body fatigues before you accumulate too much of those bad hormones. But when you're in that middle zone, again, another term I've heard it called is that sweet spot, that mid zone, it's not hard enough that you fatigue from it and you have to stop, but it's just hard enough that you start producing these bad hormones that you can do it for long amounts of time, and you start building up these harmful hormones that just start to cause fatigue. They're linked with overtraining, they're linked with demotivation, they're linked with plateauing, they're linked with bad results. The biggest effect I find that has on people is that their high intensity becomes of a lower quality. They stop enjoying their high intensity. Their mood decreases as well when you do this training. Demotivation happens. Ultimately, just the training experience is a lot less enjoyable. It's a lot less predictable. It's a lot harder to balance with a job when you have high stress at another job as well, because things like whatever family or work increase these hormones, so you don't want to go on the rowing machine and produce more of these hormones when you don't need to. The other interesting thing about this, there's plenty of studies that show that you get the same benefit from the low intensity training and the middle intensity. Like, you can get the same benefit, but that middle intensity is a far riskier way to train. There's some studies that show, you can get similar increases in fitness for some people that can do low intensity and that middle intensity. The Polarized Training got more benefit from it, slightly more, but the threshold you can get faster is spending time in that threshold zone, but it's also far riskier. Now, in that same study, it talked about how people who did the threshold training also can get regression. You can go slower. So it then becomes it's then like, for me, it's like, why do you want to try this riskier method? It's purely to satisfy an ego. It's purely because people don't like getting on the machine and that feeling of that, you know, their friend beside them is going faster. They've seen scores on the internet and they want to be able to produce big scores for long amounts of time. Or their coach is telling them that they need to push on their low intensity. But a lot of the time it's an unwillingness to accept that, you know, low intensity can feel easy and you can get on the machine and get progress and not feel like you're working hard and get benefit from it. And so often I see it with other coaches where they just don't, coaches want you to go fast as well in the same way you do, and it takes a lot of confidence to be able to prescribe an athlete a low intensity and sit there and watch them go very slowly, relatively, and see, maybe it's at a lake or another course, and see the competitors or whatever, and they're doing their low intensity and they go miles ahead of them, or you go out and, you know, you're getting passed by somebody that you know on a 2K you can go well faster than. But it's just like, I would say it's cowardly to not try. It takes courage to try these like new aspects, and you need to be cocky and have a big enough ego to actually go slow enough as well. But that's kind of where it gets more into the mindset again, a lot of these. But look, generally with my experience, again, this is something that I used to get into the GB team. I was able to perform more consistently. My high intensity quality went up. My motivation to do high intensity increased. You know, you're holding back most of the time. You kind of get a bit anxious and you're like, right, I want to get on the erg and do 3x2K, or I want to get in the boat and smash these pieces, because you're holding back all the time. And that's a much better way to approach it. It's far more enjoyable. Like, number one, you get better results from it, you get more consistency from it, so that's a selling point in itself. But you also enjoy your training more. It's more, it balances better. It works better for elite rowers, but it also works better for master rowers who have, you know, to race for a 1K or a 2K that also are aging, so recovery takes longer, or also have a stressful job, so they can't always be going down and thrashing themselves. Sometimes getting on the rowing machine, just having a nice low intensity to work at, is far better way to balance your life. And kind of one last thing I think as well is that it ties in better with the fact that you have to learn to get it right on the day. And if you get used to getting down to the rowing machine or the boat park or whatever, and you perform to a high intensity every day, and every day is the same, you get numb to it. And when it comes to racing or performing and being able to perform on the day, you know, you're not racing every day. You need to practice having that switch where it's like, right, okay, it's go time. We need to switch on. We need to perform. And I think if you're constantly showing up and doing high intensity every day, you just get numb to that kind of that sort of side of it. And for me, it's another thing. It just ties in better with the sport. There's a study out there that shows that pyramidal training, which is actually can be just as beneficial as polarized training, which pyramidal is like, most of your polarized and pyramidal both have equal amounts of low intensity. Polarized training has the high intensity and no middle intensity, but then pyramidal actually has just that threshold training and very, very little high intensity. There's a study that shows that they can both be equally beneficial, but for me, the reason I wouldn't go towards pyramidal is you need to practice that high intensity, you need to practice going hard in training, and also like purely from a rhythm, technical side of it, you need to practice the technique of going hard, and you need to practice seeing speeds and splits that are fast. I think that just about covers it. I've talked a lot, obviously, about this. Plenty of little tangents, little kind of branches that we can go along. So let me know your questions, and then that will help me decide what next topics I'll talk about. Plenty for me to ramble about. But if you've enjoyed this video, if you found it helpful, if you find polarized training convincing, then subscribe to my channel, because that's what I prescribe to people, that's what I preach. That's how I get results for people. I'll be posting more information on that. And again, if you like this content, like it, it tells me that I should make more of it. But yeah, Oh yeah, and if you disagree, if you sat and watched this whole video, they're angry, get in the comments, man. Engagement helps the algorithm. Get fighting with me. I'll maybe, who knows? Yeah, I'm always open. I mean, if there was a video that got published, there were studies that started showing that threshold training was the best, I would do it. I would start to experiment with it. So if you've got some good arguments, let me know. I've got an open mind. My job is to get results for people and to promote information that's going to increase people's quality of life and get them results at rowing. So of course I'm open to new ideas. That's the cool thing about sport. But I'm going to get into another little tangent here, so right, I'm going to stop it. Goodbye.